Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this new episode of Converse with a Coach. My name is Mireille Karera, and I am your host for today. So welcome to today's episode. That is going to be quite an exciting episode. If you are joining us for the very first time, welcome to Converse with a Coach. Today, we are in it for a treat with a special guest from South Africa. I'm going to introduce my guest, Gugulethu Mfuphi, who is a broadcaster, conversation strategist from Johannesburg, South Africa. Before I introduce Gugulethu in a moment, allow me to just quickly go through a few house checks and housekeeping rules. Every Sunday, and sometimes every other Sunday, we host a Converse with a Coach with the aim really to give you an opportunity for you to speak to coaches like myself or my colleagues from around the world, but also give you an opportunity to talk to thought leaders, experts in their field with one goal. That one goal is to start the week lifted up, hopeful, joyful, and ready to tackle a new week. And today, indeed, the topic will speak to that very specific topic of hope, good news, etc. Now, for you joining us for the first time, we host this show at 6 p.m. Kigali time or 4 p.m. GMT. If you're following us from North America, we are streaming live at 11 a.m. Standard Time. For you to be sure that you do not miss any of these episodes, can I invite you to right now click on that subscribe button right there. Click on subscribe button so that you get to follow new episodes, and also you can follow other episodes that we have covered since launching Converse with a Coach back in August last year. The next 60 minutes with our excellent speaker will be interactive. So I would invite you to share your comments in the chat, ask a question to our speaker, who is indeed an expert on the topic of news. So be sure to ask questions and also comment if there's anything you would like to share with us, with my guest or myself relating to the topic. But before we start, hey, can I hear where you are joining us from? If you are joining us from Rwanda, can you just say hello from Rwanda or from South Africa? And I'm welcoming special guests from South Africa. Just drop a note in the chat, in the comments, and say where you are joining us from. I know we always have guests from Canada, North America. Just give us a shout out so we know where you are connecting from. All right, so that is all I had to say in terms of housekeeping rules before we get started and before we bring on the special guest for today. And my special guest is Gugulethu Mfuphi. Gugulethu, welcome to Converse with a Coach.
A very good evening to you, Mireille. I should be saying bonjour. Such a great pleasure to be invited to this platform, and thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you. And you are joining us from South Africa. I presumed and assumed it's Johannesburg. Was my assumption correct or not?
100% correct. I'm actually born and bred in Johannesburg. My family's got a background of being based in Johannesburg, so firmly rooted here, but definitely a firm individual who has a heart for the continent.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you for making time to speak to us. And I must say, looking at the topic and your great achievements, I should be intimidated to interview someone who's done this for years as a professional news anchor and TV personality. But it's a pleasure and honor to have you.
I must say thank you so much. No need to be intimidated at all. I think in the very first engagement that we had, I was blown away and taken aback by how many Rwandans refer to you as the Oprah of Rwanda. So I'm excited, and I'm the one that's actually more anxious to be on this platform here this evening. But I know we'll have a phenomenal conversation nonetheless that will have a positive impact on the audience too.
Indeed, a positive impact is the aim and the reason why we exist, the reason why this show indeed exists. For the audience in Rwanda and around the world that may not know you, let me say a little bit about you. Gugulethu Mfuphi, as you now know, she is from South Africa, Johannesburg. She is a conversation strategist, a broadcaster, radio host at Kaya FM, one of the most amazing radio stations in South Africa, and formerly a news anchor at CNBC Africa, and moderates and chairs a lot of platforms with key decision makers. When I was thinking about having a topic around good news and bad news, which is really the main aim of our conversation, is how do we go about sourcing good news in a place where there's a lot of bad news? You came to mind. You also were referred to me as one of the specialists on the topic. So with that, I guess it will be proper for us to get to the tradition of this show. And the tradition of the show is really to share with the audience how we met. Can you share with our audience how we met, Gugulethu?
Certainly, I'm excited to. And I must say, maybe it's not such an unusual way to meet given the times that we live in, right? Just even this engagement on a digital platform. And for those who aren't aware, how Mireille and I actually met was through an introduction of a colleague and a very good friend of mine, Georgie Ndirangu. Georgie and I go way back, a few years back. We were both colleagues at CNBC Africa, and he's a renowned journalist, a broadcaster as well, who's worked his way up through various media companies, both in Kenya and specifically in Rwanda, where he's really managed to build quite a profession for himself as a respected voice within the media fraternity across the continent. And Georgie and I often refer to as having a G thing, Georgie and Gugu. So we've often worked together at conferences and referred to it as a G thing. And the work that we do, given that it's similar in the various streams of hosting and moderating conversations. And he was kind enough to actually alert me to the fact that you were looking to host this particular platform and engage in a conversation. So I guess if it wasn't for the G thing that Georgie and I have, maybe this conversation wouldn't be taking place today. But I guess we both extend our gratitude to Georgie for making this connection happen today.
That's right, indeed. So Georgie indeed is one of the most renowned journalists I know, has made a good impact in Rwanda. He's originally from Kenya and now is Nairobi working for BBC. Indeed, he's the common denominator. And I love the G thing. It's a good thing. And guess what? The G thing is continuing. Looking at what's at the back, it's written good news, right? And we're talking about good news today. So that is the G thing in motion right there.
I like it. I like it. I hope the good news translates into a good feeling and a good mood that will hopefully have everyone in at the end of this particular conversation.
That's right, indeed. Now, back to the topic of our conversation. We circulated on our respective platforms the theme of this specific program. And the theme is, how can we source good news in a world full of bad news? And a bit of context for the audience. Particularly those who are joining for the first time. As I said earlier, I am a coach, life coach, leadership coach, business coach, and talking about emotions, feelings, etc. is part of what we do as part of the leading organizations, etc. So the mindset, the psychology of things is one of the main things that all of us around the world need to pay a lot of attention to. Our mental wellness, our mindset in the midst of all the chaotic things that are going, both professionally, personally, health-wise, and otherwise. Now, when we were talking with Gugulethu, we just thought, there's gotta be a connection between what we see coming through our screens in the media and also how it affects us. So what is the impact of what we see with our eyes and how does it affect us? Hence the theme, sourcing good news and a world full of bad news. Now, for the next couple of minutes, I will also give you all an opportunity to share, but our goal is to have you leave this platform having learned from our excellent specialists in the area of news, in the area of delivering different types of news to a wider audience, to millions through various media platforms. And before we even get to that, Gugulethu, can I maybe hear a little bit about you from a professional standpoint? You know, what have you done? What is your history with delivering news or speaking to various platforms so that our viewers today, live or later, can have a perspective as to how you truly are an authority figure on this topic? Go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that and the introduction that you've shared. You're quite right. So in the title that you referred to me as is Conversation Strategist. And I think for many, they might frown and actually ask themselves, goodness, what on earth does that actually mean? Well, it's really a new concept in terms of categorizing the work that I engage in with a multitude of clients who actually speak and engage to various stakeholders through the art of conversation. It's a statement and a title that actually started from a colleague of mine, Nozipho Mbajwa, now known as Nozipho Shabalala, who has actually helped in terms of professionalizing and adding this title to the stream of work that we do. And when you think of what it is that we do, essentially, Mireille, is with my journalistic background and academic background, though, within finance and accounting, specific to what it is that I do is engaging with a number of clients from various sectors of society who have a message and understanding their strategy, how it is that they plan to execute that, and assisting them in communicating that to various additional stakeholder groups that they would like to speak to. So whether it's members of the banking fraternity and executives there, whether it's members of the government trying to explain new policies, these are all the number of conversations that I essentially engage in. The beauty about the background that I've worked in before is the fact that I've been able to do this on multiple platforms. So as mentioned, traditionally started off as a journalist, as a news anchor really within the South African news space and communicating through that particular field. Television, broadcast, I've also worked as a print journalist before, also working online. So that particular engagement in terms of understanding the world of journalism and media as we source, gather, integrate, interrogate, as well as look to interpret news and share that with the public is fundamental to the background that I've established. However, I've been lucky enough to also engage in conversations at conferences and on much larger platforms where decision makers and influential leaders are often part of the panel and the conversation, but also part of the audience. So if you think of themes like the World Economic Forum, clients, including institutions like many of the banking institutions in South Africa and across the continent, other members of the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, I've had the ability through conversation again to engage with these clients in terms of understanding what their mandate is and interpreting their strategy to be able to land or in a way that is relatable to the respective stakeholders who need to hear, digest, understand and interpret that message into action and consequential action that will then take place. So I guess from a professional point of view, you can say that I use my voice to really not just speak, but rather engage, listen, and interrogate a number of themes for a positive impact in terms of the understanding of strategies and consequences for these respective stakeholders.
I like what you just said, that you utilize your voice to communicate with various key stakeholders. And interestingly enough, the word voice is powerful because our words can create worlds, they can shape minds, they can shape things, and ultimately they can shape also how people feel, right? Whether we're utilizing our voices or words to lead towards the positive or the negative, using my props at the back. So your voice really is something that you've utilized for positive delivery and communication of what's going on. So thank you for giving us a perspective as to what you have done on the various platforms. Now, building upon that, Gugulethu, we know that professionally, we see everyday news anchors professionally delivering, on point news neutrally, because you are trained to do that, right? And I felt that you will be a great person to have insight into what goes on as you source, as you go through the process of finding out what's new, positive or negative, delivering it, but at the same time, remaining positive. So could you walk us through, really, from a personal point of view, how that all works and sinks in when you see, let's say, company X in sector X has had 10,000s of people being let go of? How do you receive it? How do you process, and how does that affect you, etc.? So over to you.
Fantastic. Well, in the world of news, I think people generally think that, we walk into a newsroom, you receive a script and you read it as eloquently as possible, right? When you're in front of a camera or behind a microphone. Right? That's what we think, and I really wish it worked out that easily. But for many newsrooms and for many journalists out there, we really actually get together as teams and interrogate, what the mandate of the organization that we're working for, and even yourselves as presenters or broadcasters actually want to appeal to. And I think that ties into a myriad of things. If we think of, what journalism is, it's really, again, analyzing, sourcing, interpreting, and then sharing a lot of that data or information with the public. And that's essentially the media standpoint that we have, fortunately, not only in South Africa, across the continent and the world over. And if you think about it, Mireille, I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with one of my earlier employers who described being a member of the media as being in a pyramid, if you can imagine one. A pyramid, and then there's a line right at the middle of that pyramid. And essentially, if you think about it, top tier are the individuals who are the drivers, the influencers, and the decision makers of policies, economic outcomes, where and how people are employed. And essentially, if you think of it, how the system and business actually works. And at the bottom of the radar are individuals who face the consequence of those decisions, but at the same time have so much power and control and influence on the status quo, depending on how much knowledge they have access to and how many resources they're able to allocate in terms of actioning some of their outcomes. So we as the media really work as information disseminators and connecting both the decision makers and the people who are on the ground and work in terms of being economically active. And I think that's quite important when it comes to the context of business news, because it's not just about reporting protest action that's taking place outside of government institutions or reporting about the number of ill individuals who might be at hospitals or potholes that might be on major highways. But when it comes to business and economic and financial news, you really are interrogating the numbers to translate what the story behind those numbers actually is. So when it comes to the world of finance, specifically within the spaces that I work in, we're very clear that when it comes to business, whilst it's important to understand the profitability of companies, what mergers and acquisitions they're taking part of, and even understanding their financial results once they are released, fundamental to the audience and us as human beings is the personalization of money, the personalization of the economy, and the personalization of understanding how it is that politics and interlinkages between various countries actually impact us directly. So when I walk into the show, Kaya Biz, that I broadcast on Kaya FM, fundamental to the conversation we have with my colleague and producer is the fact that how is it affecting our pockets, being our purses or our wallets? How is it affecting our pensions? And that could also be long-term savings or investments that we have. And how is it affecting our property? Because those are the three asset classes essentially that are primary to our day-to-day activities, but also interlink with the long-term wealth creation objectives that we actually aim to achieve. So at times it can be tricky, but essentially the messaging is to actually understand when we talk about GDP figures that are declining and this weaker economy, what does it actually mean? Does it mean that I'm in a position where I'm less likely to earn a higher income? Am I in a position where I'm less likely going to be able to qualify for a loan to build a property or rent a property? Does it mean that the money that I'm putting away under my bed or in a bank account or in an investment account is actually less likely going to grow and accumulate the wealth levels or interest levels that I actually want to achieve? So we've often found that when it comes to money and the economics and business, whilst it can be filled with jargon, filled with a lack of or huge amount of terminology and a lack of interconnectedness, there really is a cycle in terms of how you and I being here today and having this conversation actually speaks to economic activity. There's a data provider who's earning income by using you and I using the internet. There's device companies that have actually earned an income given the equipment that we've actually purchased, the ring lights, the laptops, the cameras, and the machines. And there's a power company as well that's benefiting, from the lighting that we're using in terms of the power supply to actually give power and electricity to the equipment that we're using. So fundamental to business and economics and how we actually source our news is going back to how the huge numbers, how the terms and the conditions of transactional activity translate to the individual. So going back to the personalization of those numbers.
And speaking to the personalization, how does it affect you when you go through all of that process as a journalist? And how can the audience really learn from that process? Maybe it is something that you have gone through or colleagues have gone through in terms of really mastering how they process certain ways of delivering news and how they feel. Is it something that you can share with the audience today?
Oh, certainly. I've actually enjoyed reading up about this particular topic, Mireille, because I recall
know.
See,
right? the technical jargons coming through, but I'm more interested in the person, in you, in the emotional intelligence side of things. So go ahead, my dear.
You're quite right. And because I remember you said to me, okay, how do we find good news in a world full of bad news? And what is that process about? And I actually had to sit back and interrogate how it is that I actually look at news. And like many individuals, automatically just looking at the background you have behind you, the red tick stands out a lot brighter than the green tick. So when I think of that X, I'm already attracted to what's behind that door with the X that I shouldn't know about. And if we translate that to how we actually process news and how we actually look to understand news, it goes back to how we are as individuals. And in reading up, I realized that there's quite a number of studies that have been done academically at the University of Michigan, one at the McGill University in Canada, and even at Cambridge University, which all identified the fact that there are trends in terms of academic research that as human beings, we're actually intrigued by negative news. We prioritize negative news. And believe it or not, that has often set the agenda for media agencies. There's a title, Mireille, and I think you're familiar with it. They say, if it bleeds, it leads. And as hurtful as that sounds, but if you think about it, any kind of bad news, if people hear about death, if people hear about wars, if people hear about unforeseen consequences of bad situations, that's essentially the shocker effect. And that's what we tend to grab you with in the media. And it's not necessarily driven by a specific agenda just to only prioritize bad news. But in terms of these academic studies, it's actually been highlighted that it has a correlation in terms of what it is that we as human beings psychologically are attached to. And one particular study, Mireille, by one of these analysts, Soroka, if I'm not mistaken, identified the fact that as human beings, we prioritize negative news because so often we are genuine optimists and we believe that things in life will work out. So when we hear the impact of bad news, we weigh out the cost that the consequences and costs of bad news actually outweigh the benefits of good news. So in terms of a defense mechanism and preparing yourself for the worst case scenario, you'd rather find out what's behind the door with the red X, just to make sure that you prepare any kind of defense mechanisms mentally to process, oh goodness, in a worst case scenario, what would I actually have to prepare for? Instead of knowing that there's some positive behind the green door or the door with the green tick, which might not be as beneficial to us as human beings.
I agree. Yes, Sorry to interject. This is really the kind of things that we teach in our life coaching classes because bad news sells, as I know, but I'm so pleased to hear that directly from clearly a conversation strategist and a media specialist. And from a psychological point of view, 100%. And the statistics say that when you look at human thoughts on a daily basis, some people say we think somewhere between 60,000 thoughts per day at the lowest level and up to 100,000 thoughts per day. And whether you think a lot or not, but 80% of your thoughts will be towards the X, the negative, rather than the tick, which is positive. So I am pleased in a way, but also kind of amazed to see that even the media, we kind of knew that recently there has been an uptick in selling more or presenting more of the negative news rather than the positive news. And thank you for reaffirming that and also putting structure to, you know, the study, etc. Now, how can people like our viewers today, like me, you know, be prepared to start a week to really remain positive, even though they are bombarded with X number of deaths of COVID or 10,000 companies laying off millions of people or jobs going down? What would you say that learning from you or your colleagues that, you know, is the right thing or the structure you can recommend for them to remain focused on this side of the door rather than that side of the door?
You're quite right. Eh? We really do need to have tunnel vision on that and a sense of focus. And when I thought about this, I must tell you that I continue to do a lot more research, and I found that there's actually very minimal online in terms of how to actually focus on good news or how to stay positive. And a lot of it really does speak to self. And that actually forced me then to actually sit back and actually self-reflect and account for, hold on, Gugu, in this year and in this world where 2020 has literally been the year of the pandemic, every day, as you correctly say, we're stating or quoting death figures, we're quoting the number of infections, we're quoting people who have lost their livelihoods in terms of jobs and income. And the list goes on in terms of the negative ramifications that have come about from this pandemic. So I think, firstly, to source the good news or to find the good news is not to ignore the bad news. So we need to stand here and actually acknowledge that there is a door with a red cross and there is a door with a positive tick. Whilst we want to understand what the consequences of the red cross is that we need to be mindful of the fact that we can't have our heads in the sand, I guess, as an ostrich would, and ignore the current environment. So when I actually had to reflect on this and the kind of year I had as a media professional, as a conversation strategist who did lose a few sources of income, by the way, because of the pandemic, I actually had to reflect, hold on, where am I in all of this and what is the reality of the situation? And that led to me actually getting a fuller understanding of where we are. So in terms of the negative news, process it, hear it out, but fully get to grasp what the consequences are of either of the outcomes. And I think maybe the 2020 pandemic has been a great highlighter of that, to actually understand, okay, when we all heard about the coronavirus, we just thought it was this weird virus, you know, that was infecting a specific city in China that had a whole lockdown, but no ways, that's not going to happen in Africa. And what happened by the time March 2020 came around? You know, half of the continent went into lockdown, and we're still experiencing the ramifications of the pandemic and the deaths and the losses of jobs and lack of investment. So I think what's important in any situation is to stand back and get a full realistic understanding of what's happening around you, you know, understanding what the problem is, where the source of the problem is, what the consequences of the problem are, and then even self-reflecting. And what I mean by that is really understanding your position in the scenario. So again, going back to the example of the COVID-19 pandemic, when it kicked off in Wuhan, the rest of us in Kigali, in Tanzania, in Johannesburg, in Lagos, were quite comfortable because we thought, well, that's a far place away. It's not going to happen in Rwanda, for example, or Lusaka. And look where we are here today, you know, in terms of understanding where we are within that consequence of this global pandemic. And most importantly, I think as well, Mireille, has been to understand what it is you can and can't control. like many people, I think a lot of us go into fright or flight mode on the back of adrenaline, and some of us tend to panic and we overreact. Hence, we even saw the headlines about this, streams at the shopping mall and people hoarding certain goods and products. And other people, we tend to just, get into a fright and we freeze and we don't know what it is that we can do. And from a personal point of view, I've even had to implement that way in my place of work at Kaya FM, a company that itself is a media representative that is meant to disseminate information. It's still a business. And as a business, it also went through a tumultuous time. And that tumultuous time led to a change in leadership, retrenchments at work, a change in terms of how we operate and how we actually execute our duties. And that was a direct threat to my level of employment, my sense of comfortability and confidence within that media company, and even a threat to, how it is that I define myself in the work that I execute in engaging in conversations with people directly. So even in that situation, I had to self-reflect and fully understand, okay, what is my role? Where am I centered? How am I influenced by this particular outcome? And what is it that I can control? If I lose my job tomorrow, can I control that? If I don't, what influence and control do I have over the level of income that I'm earning? If I don't, what control do I have on how it is that I'd be able to broadcast and fulfilling the mandate that I have personally for myself and the mandate that the organization has according to its licensing agreement in terms of broadcasting? So from a personal point of view, I think a lot of it, again, goes back to not ignoring that there is a red cross and a door that you're not supposed to enter into, but fully understand those consequences, but know realistically your positioning, fully understand the consequences of the environment, and then take charge of what you can control. What you can't control, as difficult as it is, but comes from a place of self-leadership where you learn to let go.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And part of personal mastery, and we teach that in our life coaching classes at our coaching academy, is to truly find how to self-motivate and how to find that center. And thank you for sharing the process from your own personal experience as someone who disseminates information and news through various platforms. Let me ask you, where do you source good news for yourself?
Great question. It might sound repetitive or airy-fairy, but I think from a sense of gratitude, firstly, from a personal point of view. And from a personal point of view, I think I've also been lucky as a member of the media to travel the continent quite extensively, to engage with a number of people from different backgrounds. And that really puts things into perspective, Mireille. I think once you live in a bubble for too long, you tend to think that your normal is normal, and it's not normal for everyone else. So the mere fact that even from a professional point of view, I am able to execute duties that I love and that I enjoy. I'm able to interact with a number of people from different backgrounds and different perspectives. And I'm able to constantly reinvest in my mind and myself and my thinking, and express my love and appreciation for people through authentic relationships with family, with friends, and with colleagues, and with new people that I'm able to engage with. I think the good news starts there, from appreciating and understanding, what are the green ticks that are working for you in your life. And then from a professional point of view, I guess it's always to try to understand that there's always opportunity. In the business community, they often say never waste a good crisis. And I never used to understand it before. But when you just look at what we've witnessed with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's really created opportunities for platforms like yourself. You are a career coach who's worked with multiple institutions the world over, and really forged some amazing networks and relationships with people in the professional space. But you've now brought that to, someone who might be a student, watching this from in Cairo or somewhere else in Iran, perhaps, and they actually get to learn a little bit more about coaching. They learn more about the different perspectives and conversations we bring into the fore. So I think when it comes to sourcing the good news is to, identify those new green shoots that have come about. And I think for the African continent specifically, it's been increased connectedness, specifically on the back of technology. It's been an increased awareness of how we need to develop and solve our own problems. And that probably goes back to the cliche of, finding African solutions for African challenges. But the truth is, we need to, right? And it's through our innovation, it's through our communication, and even, self-betterment and self-improvement, because I think sourcing good news also comes from identifying that as human beings, we've proven to be resilient. And believe it or not, a lot of the things that actually happen in life are not happening for the first time. It's not the first time that there's a pandemic. It might be the first time for our generation, but we do know that, the Spanish flu and a myriad of other illnesses have taken over the globe before, and people have come through that. So for us as individuals and, as members of the continent, we need to identify that we've been through challenges before. Our forefathers got through them, our parents got through them, and perhaps for our generation, this is our way of, stepping up to the level of resilience that's required from within us.
Indeed. Thank you. I love what you said about never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So that is powerful. And in fact, last Sunday's episode was indeed addressing the flip side of crisis. There's always a positive nuances or positive side effects to crises, or when there are negative outcomes to that. There's always a positive. There's always a yin and yang element to whatever that happens. And certainly, what you just shared is amazing wisdom. I can see there's a few more people who've just joined. Can we hear from you? If you have any questions or comments, or would like to share your experience on how you go about sourcing good news, or what type of tips you would like to share with the audience in remaining grateful, just like Gugulethu said, so that you can remain positive and also know how to turn around those crises into opportunities. So, now we know what a journalist, news anchor, broadcaster does to remain hopeful and balanced in terms of emotional intelligence, even though the platform that you utilize may not always share positive news. Going back to what we said earlier on about, negative news or bad news selling, and some broadcasting agencies perhaps may tend to focus on the bad news, war, crisis, etc. Out of curiosity, in the realm of journalism, is there any kind of time where you have to balance? Let's say we've had this amount of bad news, let's just balance with positivity, or you just get orders to release news as they come. What's that process? I'm just curious.
That's a very good question, Mireille, and I'll tell you that it's often been the debate of many boardrooms and newsrooms in news fraternities across the continent. And I'll tell you, the first reason being commercial interests versus editorial interests.
Right.
There's a large number of broadcast institutions across the continent that are owned by the respective governments. And that's primarily meant to drive information and disseminate information to communities so that they're well aware of what's actually taking place. But at times when there's a commercial interest, whether the institution is owned privately or the government institution is receiving funding from a private individual or private company, that's where the scales tend to get unbalanced, because then when issues that are contentious tend to come up, or there's too much bad news that comes up, and it might be focused on a specific individual or specific institution or specific stakeholder. And a typical example that we're well aware of on the continent is increased corruption, right? That would tend then to rock the boat in terms of who leads the drive for independence, in terms of, are we focusing on the independent, on the editorial priority, which is the sharing of information and, uplifting the knowledge of the general public? Or are we going to ride the commercial interest, which is making sure that this institution will continue receiving the financing and funding that it needs in order to remain operational? So that tends to be the first place where that kind of argument would actually stem from. Following that would be the argument in terms of the reputation of the organization. And we've seen that come through as well in South Africa, where specific organizations have been known to be just overwhelmingly negative, overwhelmingly critical, and they receive a lot of criticism about that. That also translates into a lack of funding that those stations receive, or a lack of listenership or participation. So what I've actually noticed, and how I actually try to approach it with my colleagues, specifically to the business environment, is a fair share of understanding the realities on the ground. And for the moment, I think it is quite unfortunate that there is a lot more negative than positive news that we tend to focus on. And that's unfortunately just the reality of the ground that we're in and the environment that we're in, but maybe also a consequence of our psychological reliance and focus on negative news. And when we do try to bring in positive news, what we've often found is that the best way to bring it about is that it has to be authentic. Nobody wants to hear positive news for the sake of saying it's positive news, right? The sun is shining in Kigali and it was shining in Johannesburg today, but we're more interested in that thunderstorm that's wrecked, a coastal town somewhere on the east of the continent. And that's quite unfortunate that I have to use those examples, but I think just even hearing how I expressed it, shows you that that's where our minds are often clicked into. But from a personal point of view, we really try to ensure that when we do focus on positive news, it's positive news that, again, can be personalized to the individual from a business and financial point of view. And when we try to drive that agenda, we also try to take our audience with us along for that journey. Because instead of trying to preach and shout good news to people, it's great when you can actually invite them along for the journey to say, look, some people have lost their jobs, but here we're finding that there's a new crew of entrepreneurs that are being developed. Are you an entrepreneur? What entrepreneurship opportunities have you tapped into? Which sectors are you looking at? How did you start your business? Did you have enough money to start your business? And once you start involving people and you create a sense of community, that's when the positive news not only, I guess, generates and spreads organically, but then there's also a ripple effect in terms of identifying key areas of interest amongst this stakeholder group, and they're able to continue evolving and growing and developing, leading to an even greater positive or good news story that can actually develop in the long term. So it's a fine balance. And as I say, dependent on the ownership of the organization, of the media structure, the mandate of the media organization, how their management is skewed towards editorial or commercial priority. And then again, the mandate of just understanding what your purpose is when it comes to serving people. And if we're here to do good, let's keep to doing good and finding the good and involving people in where the good news actually is.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for shedding more light into that. And actually, as you were speaking about organizations having to decide on priorities, whether the priority is editorial versus commercial, for whatever purposes or agendas there are. In my mind, as you were speaking, there's a news channel that came to my mind in America, and we will not cite the source. I know that currently, media in America is being reviewed and looked at with kind of a raised eyebrow because of the past elections that took place in America. And that I could certainly see how that played out, because some of the channels or agencies are being perceived to follow a certain agenda for commercial purposes rather than ethical journalism that is supposed to be neutral and unbiased. So I really appreciate that you just shared that it's not a reality just out there or outside of the continent, but it is also one of the key decisions that that organizations or boardroom conversations, as you said, that are taking place on the continent. So it is good to hear, because what we see come through our screens certainly shapes minds, shapes how the public also thinks and feels and acts, because decision-making processes are also determined by the landscape of what is the perception based on news. And having worked for Thomson Reuters before, and Reuters is one of the greatest news agencies in the world, I know that back then, depending on the news and information, the shares, the market will go depending on what you report. So there is that kind of influence that news stations or media have on people generally, and obviously businesses as well.
Mireille, I think it's so important that you mention that. You're quite right in terms of highlighting that. And it reminds me of another conversation that I had with my earlier employer, there used to be this attachment and enthusiasm from some of my colleagues to actually try to write a story that will shift or move the share price. You know, the joke in the newsroom would be, oh, did you move the share price? Did you shift the share price? And that actually just shows you that the amount of control and influence that, you know, we as the media have. And maybe even to liken it to conversations that people tend to have, you know, engagements with themselves, engagements with their colleagues, engagements with their loved ones. But I think even with what you do within the coaching fraternity, in terms of leadership, is that how you lead, how you communicate, how you use your voice actually does have a direct impact on how you shape the environment around you. And for members of the media fraternity, specifically in finance and business, you can actually influence the minds of shareholders. And we recently saw that again in the US, GameStop, I believe, a digital company that sells games. And then there was a group of retail investors who used a particular platform, Reddit, in order to communicate that, hold on, this company is going down, but we're going to buy more shares to pump up its share price. And that actually rocked the relationship that Wall Street has with retail investors versus institutional investors or hedge fund organizations. So that's, I think, a clear example as to how, as the media and how as people, though, when we are a united force and when we share a specific rhetoric, can actually shift the needle and the landscape in terms of people's behavior and people's thinking. And that, I think, is a great leadership lesson, you know, how you lead self, how you lead others, how you lead organizations, and how you lead the public. How you use your voice, how you use that power, and where you direct it to, whether for good or for bad, actually has an influence on the outcomes that will be developed. So I think a very critical point that you touched on.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I'm seeing there's the audience commenting. Someone with the ID AZ Tips says, hello, we wish you to prepare this emission, which is a program in Kinyarwanda. Okay, thank you very much. Could you share a little bit more about your interests so that we know how to address that? Thank you. We have about 14 minutes left, and out of the 14 minutes left, let me just hear from the audience. If you've got any questions or comments, or you would like to know more from Gugulethu in terms of good news, bad news, media, or anything you really wanted to ask a journalist, this is your time. This is your chance to do that. Now we've got 13 minutes to do that. Okay, great. So I don't see any more questions so far, so we'll come back to that. So we talked about mindset. We talked about what we can do to really lead ourselves, master our emotions, master our minds, irrespective of what comes through our screens. And we also talked about agendas that specific corporations may have in terms of dissemination of positive or negative news. I guess the tick or the cross as the analogy at the back. But is there anything else that you believe that can be a teachable moment from your experience in the media, in the news, in having these strategic conversations with leaders? I saw on your Twitter platform that you were with the president of South Africa on a platform. But having spoken to all of these great leaders, is there anything that the audience can learn from you on this topic?
Thank you for that. And I actually want to take it back to the feedback that we got from one of the members who was commenting on the audience, A to Z, requesting that if you could, do this in Kenya, Rwanda. And I think that's another great starting point that we often take for granted, right? That's whilst right. English has been a great, and other languages have been a great platform and, translator for us to be able to connect using one particular language. But when you are able to express yourself and express news and express positive or negative news, sometimes you might even notice that there's a difference in meaning depending on what language you use. And a good example is in South Africa where, in my native language being isiZulu, things can mean different things depending on how they're expressed. And when you translate them directly to English or another Western language, it just doesn't have the same impact, right? And I think maybe from a media point of view across the continent, a great learning point is for us to actually be able to express news of great consequence to the public in our native languages. Now, that's naturally something that would be respective to different regions and different countries and areas, depending on the dialect that is discussed. But I think when it comes to global leaders as well, you're quite right. I've had the opportunity to interact with quite a few of the presidential leaders, including His Excellency in Rwanda. And what I think we often tend to forget, and even myself and a few of my colleagues, we often, respectfully so, elevate our leaders to a particular platform, and we forget that they're human beings, that they're individuals who, like us, have needs, have desires, have objectives, have had tough and difficult decisions to take, have had to be, placed in consequences that they're not necessarily comfortable with, but have had to execute on those and live with those consequences. So I think when it comes to the messaging of both good and bad news, and it might sound as though I'm repeating this, and maybe because it's important, but it goes back to people. And I believe the president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, put this perfectly once during the plight of the pandemic, that we don't know how to bring people back to life, but we know how to bring economies back to life. And I think regardless of what it is that we engage in, whether we are representing government organizations, whether we are leaders of nations or of tribes, whether we are leaders of great multinational organizations or entrepreneurs and leaders of our own institutions that we're looking to build, it all starts with people. So unless I can relate with Mireille as an individual and engage on elements that are important to us, we won't be able to grow, we won't be able to share our messaging, nor will we be able to find positive outcomes to drive despite the negative environment that we might be in. So I think that's an important element to always remember for individuals within their personal capacities and the professional roles that they serve, that it goes back to people and the relationships and the interconnectedness that you can have, which, through that collaborative and united power, despite the red crosses, you're able to find the green ticks then working together.
That's right. That is so profound. What you just said about the quote from the president from Ghana, and I'm paraphrasing, I think he said something along the lines of, we don't know how to bring people to life, but we know how to bring companies back to life. Here is a perspective. I think from a psychological point of view, emotionally, there is a way we can bring people back to life through our voices, through our words, through how we lift other people up. Every day, every week, we are presented with opportunities to revive, which is to bring something back up to life through our mental capacity, what we choose to focus on, negative or positive. So why can't we be those catalysts, that source of good news? And really, I think this is a wonderful place for us to kind of draw towards the end of the conclusion in just saying, how can we revive? How can we resuscitate people's morals or energy or mindset by being the positive voice, by being self-disciplined in having positive thoughts rather than negative thoughts? Is it easy? Probably not. Is it difficult? Possibly. But here is some good news, and you've got the good news right there in the middle. The good news is that you have people like Gugulethu who are absolutely positive people that are there to focus on the positive. And you've got people like our colleagues at Cora Coaching Group, our coaches that are always there to help you remain focused, remain sharp, and focus on what is positive, what is constructive, rather than destructive. Can I invite you, as you start the week, that you really focus on that good news, on the green tick, rather than that cross, and see, what can I do to focus more on the positive? And I can share one thing that I do. There are specific news channels or platforms that I actively do not tune into it because I know the outcome. The outcome will be leading me towards this negative cross. So I choose for sources. I source good news through different other platforms or even people that I associate with. And we've got that in our personal life. We've got friends, family members, colleagues that will tend to go this way rather than that way. Can I encourage you this week as you start the week that you truly focus on this side of the brain, which is the positive side of the brain and good news. So let me give you some time to share your closing remarks as we draw towards the close of this session. Gugulethu, any teachable moments, takeaway notes that you would like to share with the audience?
Thank you so much for that, Mireille. I think you've also put it so succinctly and beautifully that we need to have boundaries and understand what information it is that we're absorbing, where the source is from, and what the intention is. And I think that usually then sets the tone for understanding how you should be interpreting that information, and if you should have a buffer towards it and a screen. And I think most importantly, as we look to start and revive the week on a positive note, as you've said, and focusing on the positive, we also need to start with self. Positive in terms of how we speak to ourselves in our minds. Sometimes I think there are themes like imposter syndrome and feeling inadequate and depression, which might even have been exacerbated by the current pandemic that we live with. And those are the voices that we hear in our head. And that often then directs our focus to even how it is that we communicate and how we speak and what we choose to focus on, which either takes us to the red cross or the positive door. So I think teachable moments from a personal point of view, as a young professional who's looking to grow and finding themselves in a very competitive environment, which has become even more so uncertain. And I'm delighted that you have a lot of references in terms of the previous speakers that you've spoken to and the young entrepreneur as well, who was from Switzerland, and the guest you had from Dubai, who, despite the environment and what it is that we're facing, everybody is just trying to do their level best. So speak well to yourself and be kind to yourself in your mind and focus on the positives from a personal point of view. And hopefully let that then translate into the influence that you want to have in the lives of others. I often say that I am a Libra, so my star sign always tries to find equilibrium and a balance and tries to be fair and friendly with everyone. I have an INFJ personality, which is introverted and intuitive, and I'm a feeler really when it comes to taking decisions and my emotions. So for me, what I've often found is that I heavily rely on my emotions when it comes to transformative leadership, to really try to have a positive impact in the lives of the people that I meet with and interact with. And whilst it's difficult to do that sometimes when we live in a transactional world, but I think it's important for us to also understand that, as you move positively into the world, just look to have some kind of positive impact in the lives of others that you share with, in how you communicate, in the language that you use, and also understanding the kind of power in your messaging and the influence that you might have on those people around you.
I love that. Speak kindly to yourself. Such a tweetable quotes that you just shared with us. How can the audience get to know more about your work and get in touch with you, Gugulethu?
Thank you so much for that, Mireille. I am a fan of the African continent. I must tell you, the last time I was in Rwanda was, I think, 2018. So I'm hoping that as the world slowly opens up again and the vaccination rollout continues, that I'll be there soon again. But that just speaks to who I am and how I am in terms of wanting to be connected to the continent. So I am available on all social media platforms at Gugulethu Mfuphi, at GUGUMFUPHI, on Instagram as well as on Twitter, and able to interact and engage with a variety of clients there. I also have details available on my personal website at www.gugulethu.co.za, and through that particular platform, I'm able to engage with individuals, potential clients, and many other partners, on a myriad of elements that we can look to engage on and partner with, whether through media interviews, or whether through collaborative exchanges in conversation, or even writing. I am an advocate for the development of the African continent and certainly want to be a part of it going forward. So shall we unite, and happy to engage.
Absolutely. Indeed. We would love to have you back in Rwanda very soon. So thank you so much for your time. As we complete, let me just announce that our next episode is not going to be this coming Sunday. It's going to be on the 21st of March, and it's going to be a very special Sunday. Stay tuned. Stay tuned for a big announcement concerning our guests with multiple guests. That will be a very different way of us delivering Converse with a Coach. So more information, more announcement will follow in the next few days. I look forward to seeing all of you. If you have not subscribed, subscribe to this channel and click like if you liked this conversation. And hey, we would like to hear from you. If there's any topic, any guest that you would like us to have for me to host on this show, let us know. Send us a message at cora-coaching.com. Thank you. I will see you very soon in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, Gugulethu. Bye-bye.